just so loads. Very excited. All right, we are now live streaming. I'm just going to, there we go. So just wait until 5:30 to get started and just welcome people as they show up. It's just us right now. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, it's a good activity for an otherwise wet evening.
Yes, yes. Everyone can stay inside and enjoy from their homes. Tisha's watching. Hey, Tisha. And Lisa Newcomb, hello. Welcome. Got good company tonight.
Excellent.
Yeah. All right, so it is 5:30, so we'll go ahead and start. Hello, everyone. Welcome to tonight's Creative Conversations. I'm Elisabeth Palmer, and tonight I'm joined by our Senior Curator of Art, Margaret Lynne Ausfeld. Before I introduce Margaret Lynne, I invite everyone to be part of the conversation by sharing your thoughts and questions in the comments. We'll be keeping an eye on those and reading them when we can. So a little introduction for Margaret Lynne first before we get into it. She graduated from the University of Alabama. Go ahead and put your roll tide, Margaret Lynne. There it is.
Roll tide.
So you graduated from Alabama with your Bachelor of Arts in Art History, and went on to earn your Master's in Art History Museum Studies at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. Go Colonials. Growing up in Montgomery, she was brought to the museum by her grandmother and would later become a volunteer while attending classes at University of Alabama. She's been with the museum now for 35 years.
Pretty close.
Okay, somewhere around there.
Somewhere in there.
And yes, so those years have made her a wonderful resource for those of us who are new to the museum and to the city. So Margaret Lynne, thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Absolutely. I'm delighted to be here.
Yes, we're happy to have you and to talk about this exhibition that we're talking about tonight is Authority Figures, Traditional African Sculpture from the collection of the MMFA and the Marty and Dilip Mehta collection. If you're unfamiliar, real quick, with traditional African sculpture, these objects serve functional purposes, being used regularly or in special ceremonies, depending on the role. So if you're new, these objects are a little bit different from what we know in Western art. The objects in this exhibition in particular were used as symbols of individuals' authority or accessing an individual's spiritual power. So Margaret Lynne, now that I've had that disclaimer out for everybody, let's begin looking at some of the objects that you've shown. And while I'm pulling those images up, do you want to talk about the exhibition?
I do. Thank you. Thanks, Elisabeth. That's wonderful. I'm so glad to be here with all of you tonight and talking about this wonderful show that we put up a couple of months ago while we were actually closed to the public. And it's interesting that this show, for the last several months, once we began opening the museum, it's right at our front door, which I think is really wonderful now because people enter the museum really through this exhibition. And I think that has given people an opportunity to experience this material in a completely new space. It's a more intimate space. And you can sort of see there on your screen that with that staff that's there in front of you in the center of that picture, that it's interesting that the ceilings in this space are very low. And so the lighting makes wonderful patterns on the walls. And that's something that several people have pointed out to me. And when I went down and looked at it, I was very fascinated too, because you really see the shapes of the material, the actual forms that they make on the wall. That you see them very clearly, and they create a sort of whole different understanding about the show itself, about the object itself, when you can see the reflection of its shape in that form. So, as Elisabeth told you, this work is taken from the collection of the museum and also from lenders who have been longtime supporters of the African collection at the museum, Dilip and Marty Mehta. And we picked these objects because we wanted to focus on different aspects of how various objects like these are used in African culture. And especially, we wanted to focus on objects that have a purpose within these various cultures to signify, or as signifiers, and that is they are signifiers that put the emphasis on figures of authority, but also that of influence, and specifically spiritual influence. So we're going to be looking at different kinds of objects that work in different ways to signify these things within the culture itself, either in the way that they're used or in ceremonies that are specifically designed to feature these objects and to communicate to the community the idea of authority or leadership within that, with that cultural structure. So can we go ahead and look at the first piece that we're going to look at tonight? And that is a wonderful thing that resembles a chair. You can see it's what we would call anthropomorphic, meaning that it has head, it's a sculpture carved of wood, has head, and that it has 3 legs, 2 of which look like the legs of a figure there at the front, because we're looking at it frontally. And we know that in looking at this, it's a female, obviously from the hairstyle and the other elements of the composition, we can see that it's a female figure. And in this particular figure, you'll see in the center, it might be a little hard to see, there's actually something called a fetish form that's there that is connected to this. Yeah, you can see where Elisabeth's pointing there. You can see that is, yes, it's connected with beads around the neck. So we'll first talk about the idea of this as a place that a person would potentially sit. We know in a lot of Western cultures, in the continent of Europe, for example, there is the idea of a throne or a seat of power. And in many cultures, that throne or seat of power is held by the person who is considered the governance of that society. So we think of, Queen Elizabeth of England, perhaps being, when she was coronated, or crowned, she was crowned in Parliament, seated on the royal throne that is specific to her position as the Queen of England. Well, in African cultures, these kinds of forms are very common. They're sometimes referred to as stools. They often don't have the back that you see there, like a backrest with the head and the other elements on it. Sometimes they are just the 3-legged seat that you see there on that particular object. And they are designed so that a person, when seated on it, is projecting the idea of authority within the culture by being, specifically by being seated on that piece of carved sculpture. That person derives authority from being seated on it. The little fetish that you see there called a Mwanahiti is also called a daughter of the throne. And the reason that it has that connection and that you see the female symbolism here is because this chair, which comes from, or seat, comes from the Luguru people, who are centered in, their territory is centered in what is present day Tanzania. And these things are depicted this way, but were not actually used for sitting on. They were used within an initiation ceremony for young women who were being initiated into adulthood. And when the initiation process was completed, a girl who had gone through that process might briefly be seated on a ritual chair of this type, but it would be only very briefly, and it would have been a step in her initiation. So it's not as if these particular objects were made in order to be seated upon it with regularity. They really were an element of ceremony, and they were very important to that ceremony, and the use of them was very restricted to the context of the ceremony, because they are projecting a spiritual engagement for that girl with the powers that are initiating her into adulthood. So the first of these kinds of symbols would be the stool or the chair. Now we're going to move on to another object that you'll see in the exhibition. And it also is going.
Staff, right?
Yes, that's correct. This one would be similar to what we would call a rod or a sword, which would have been used as a symbol in Western cultures of power, authority, and leadership. If you are familiar with portraits of kings from France and England, you'll know that when their portraits were painted, they would frequently hold a rod in their hand that was a symbol of leadership or power. In these staffs would create a similar part of the regalia of people who were leaders of the cultures of Africa. And they were derived from the form of a spear, that is a war weapon, much the same way that the sword was sort of the origin of the rod that was held by kings in Western culture. The spear was the source of the form for this staff, and they're sometimes also just called spears or lances. This particular one that you're looking at would have been part of the regalia of a leader of the Cuba group. And they were basically passed down as symbols of leadership or power within multiple generations of families. You can't see very well, but there's little small engraved plaque, yeah, exactly, on these that would have identified the ownership of this to a particular group or family within the Cuba tradition. So this was a hereditary position, much as the leaders in Western Europe that were part of a monarchical system. In the same way, they were hereditary systems. These were hereditary as well. So this was something that was passed down to from father to son in order to transfer that authority from one generation to another. And we're going to look at a third object. And this one, the other two have a distinct relationship to what we think of as objects that would convey the idea of leadership or authority or nobility in Western cultures, in Europe, for example. This one is a wonderful kind of interesting example of something that would have been related to the idea of a crown. It's obviously a hat or a cap, and you see that it's made of a kind of raffia, and it's been covered with shells, with cowrie shells. And in the tradition of this people, the Lega peoples, who were centered in what is present day the Democratic Republic of the Congo, this type of a hat or cap was worn by the chief members of what was called the Bwami Society. And it was a membership-based group of elders and influential members of that community, that culture. And they did performances where they would convey the moral and social codes for behavior for their communities by doing ceremonial dances and performances in public spaces. But the people who were the most important leaders and the seniors members of that group, the Bwami Society, were allowed to wear these cowrie encrusted caps. And you can't see it. Normally, this would have a more evident group of little feathers at the top, where you see that little peak at the top. There were feathers that were attached to this. There is some feather left there, but sometimes in other caps they may be a little bit more prominent. So if you saw this in another picture or another context, that you might see feathers attached to it a little more prominently. So all of those elements, the feathers, which are attached to the bird, which is a symbol from nature that we're going to discuss a little bit more later, and the cowrie shells, which were very valuable because they came from obviously the sea, and the sea was a long way from where the Bwami the Bwami Society was doing their performances with the lega. So they were trade goods. That meant they were rarer and more difficult to get. So they had that value as trade goods. So all of these elements we've just looked at, these three different types of material, relate to what we think of in Western culture as the regalia, or elements that were associated with leadership or kingship. So these were elements of that in these societies that we might compare to those that we would find in Western Europe, for example, under the nobility or monarchical type rule. So we're going to move on a little bit now, and we're going to look at a different installation shot from the actual show here at the museum. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the forms that you are looking at in the case that's there on the screen. And two of them are there on the right, and they are related to one another in terms of their use. One of them, the female that's standing there with the yellow dress with the blue trim, is what would have been called a spirit spouse, or a blolo bien and a blolo blah. One is female and the other is male. As you can see in this group of two, the male is the smaller of the two, down there at the bottom, wearing like a little tan shirt and shorts. And then the larger female is dressed. Both of these are dressed, as you can see, in 20th century clothing. This is not antique clothing, or clothing that would have been worn outside of a community or in a more casual setting. They're almost dressed up. And the reason for that is that these sculptures had very specific functions. They were considered spirit spouses or spirit figures. And a person within the ballet group, a male would have a female spirit spouse. The female would have a male spirit spouse. And they were, these spirit spouses played a role in the life of the person that they were attached to as intercessors in the spirit world for the person here on earth, to bring them good fortune or to prevent bad things happening to them. The people who were in the physical world would count upon their spirit spouse to take care of them. So in thanks for doing that, in appreciation, the person on earth was expected to give gifts and treat the spirit spouse figure much as they would have wanted to treat the actual person who was their spirit spouse in the spirit world kindly. So it was typical, or it was a tradition at one time. I don't know how common these traditions are at this point anymore, but at one time it was a tradition for the person's spirit spouse, the individual, the physical person on earth, would have slept by themselves at night for overnight, so that the spirit spouse could come into the dreams of the person. And then at that point, they were in contact with the spirit spouse. The next day, when they woke up from their dream, they would offer gifts to the spirit spouse in order to appease them, make them happy, and make them want to take care of them in the spirit world. So that was the purpose of these figures. And as you can see, they were very specific to their purpose. One represents a small man or male, looks rather like a young boy, but may have been a teenager. And then the girl who's standing beside him wearing the yellow dress appears to be a young person also. Both of these are younger people who are depicted as the spirit spouses. So within that same case, if you look over to the left, there's a very interesting form that we would kind of describe as an anthropomorphic spoon or ladle. It's called awakimia, and it is associated with the Dan, D-A-N people, who would have occupied the Ivory Coast or Liberia, that territory now. This particular sculptural form would have been presented to a female member of the Dan society or group in acknowledgement of leadership or specifically her generosity. Typically in the culture of the Dan culture, large spoons like this or ladles were used to serve rice or to provide nourishment. And the use of the legs, the combination of the ladle or spoon form on the human legs, was indicative of a reference to the woman who was the bearer of this spoon, the people she would feed would travel to come to her and would be fed by her generosity. So this is in recognition of an important woman within the culture who was recognized for her generosity. And in recognizing her, they would present her with this, what is a sculpture that is a combination of legs, that is people traveling to be fed by generosity, and the spoon form, which we could also call a ladle, that would have been used to give out rice. Not that this would have been used literally to serve anyone. It was more of a trophy to a certain extent, or something that the person would have taken and had as a gift in recognition of her service. So it's very interesting, though, the combination, when you look at this, of the legs and the ladle or spoon form is very typical for this particular type of object. You will see this many times in museums where African art is on display, things that are very similar to that. So they followed a very particular kind of form within the Dan group to recognize the generosity of women there. Okay, so we're going to move again to another image of work actually installed in the exhibition. And there you can see again.
that hat again, right?
Yes, it is. Exactly. That's how it looks within the installation itself, along with two other objects that are associated with the Lega Bwami Society again. You remember that we spoke about the Bwami Society as being a part of the Lega culture, and that the group itself, its purpose was to teach codes of moral behavior through performance. The mask that you see there to the right is what's called or referred to as a maskette. It's a small version. It's not something that would have been worn by someone over their head or face. It's an actual miniaturized version of one that would have been worn for performance, but it was made or commissioned for an important member of the Bwami Society, and it was basically commissioned by him from a maker in order to convey some of the power of the performance mask to that individual in the group. So it was a way of that person tying that himself and his value into the group through the use or the ownership of this miniaturized mask that we see in the case. So again, that's another object that is conveying the power of a position within the community through the physical object of ownership. And that in this case would have been for the lega, the cap that you see with the cowrie shells, or the masquette that has that raffia extending from it that mimicked what would have been worn in a performance. So moving on to the next image, which is an installation piece. This is a beautiful piece of woven textile. And textile is as important in traditional African art and culture as wood or metal or any other fiber, especially raffia fiber and other kinds of natural jute or other natural fibrous material that would have been gathered by people in the communities, and eventually it was woven on looms or sometimes by hand in strips that were then put together to create these larger pieces of fabric. I think you can see that this large piece of fabric is hanging from a roll at the top of the wall there. And you can see that there are distinguishable strips of design. There are 3 of them there side by side that go vertically, yes, up and down that piece of fabric. And they have symbols on them. You can see there is a prominent use of what we would think of as like a fork-like shape that is associated with natural plant, like a tree or a leaf form. You also have geometric shapes that, and in some ways, ones that are very similar. It's interesting when you look at this. It's interesting to look at how some of those shapes, to me, when I look at the African American quilts in our collection, we have there's a pattern called rooftop. And there's a kind of concentric square, rectangles within a square shape that's very similar to that in this piece of fabric too. So these geometric shapes all tie into natural forms that are in nature, like trees or leaves or water. And these are kind of abstractions that relate to those ideas. This particular Kuba cloth, again, made by people who would be living in present day in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. This particular one is woven of raffia, and it's embroidered with a lot of those abstract lines and shapes that we just talked about into that cloth that has been woven. Within the Kuba group, textiles created and played a very major role in designating the elite people in the group. And this particular textile would have been worn by a woman, and it would have been wrapped around her body. That is, we're looking at it long ways now. It would have been wrapped on the long part would have been wrapped, the length would have been wrapped around her body several times to participate in ceremonies of the community. And it designated her as an elite member of the community. In many cases, for very important figures, these beautiful cloths would actually have been a burial shroud for those people. And they would, if they had been owned and used by them consistently within the community. So not always, but frequently, this is the kind of thing that would have been utilized in a ceremony that was a funereal ceremony too. Finally, we're going to look at one more case in the installation that has some very interesting objects in it that are quite different. You'll see that there are 2 objects here that are made of wood. The one at the lower left is a tradition from the dance performances. It was an object used in the dance performances of the Yoruba. And it was, this is just consistently referred to as a dance wand. You see what I'm talking about is the one there on the little stand that has what we call a double axe blade motif at the top. And that double axe blade was associated with one of the gods worshipped by the Yoruba, whose name was Shango. In Yoruba, he was the Oshe, or the deity of the leader of that group, that tribal culture. Shango was the chief deity of that group. And he was believed to be the creator of thunder and lightning. And the thunder and the lightning were caused when Shango would hurl these huge boulders down to earth. And the idea of thunder, lightning, and fire was very important within the tradition of the Yoruba people, and they had other orisha that were specific to various purposes. We're going to talk about that again in just a moment. But I did also want to talk about another metal figure that's there, that small horse with the rider seated on it, with the sword over his shoulder, is from the Dogon people who are located in Mali. Originally, this iron little figure with the sword would have been attached to a staff. It would have been a finial. And like the staff that we saw at first, it would have been basically an item of regalia that was related to the authority of the leadership of that particular group of the Dogon people. It would have conveyed the importance of that figure as a leader in that group, because the Dogon people believed that people, that is human beings, first descended to earth on horses, that they actually came to earth on horses. And there's a long story that goes along with that and why, and it's a wonderful mythology. It's very complicated, but when you see the horse and rider, you would automatically associate that with the Dogon, who believe in an origin story that involves the horse and the rider coming to earth and bringing mankind to earth. Finally, I wanted to talk about the last object that you see in the case, which is that wonderful, very elaborate staff that's at the back of the case. And I'm going to let Elisabeth kind of come to me now in my office. And I actually took the staff out of the case. I didn't, but somebody who's very kind and generous went down and got it for me, because I wanted to talk a little bit about...
Curator.
Yes, I am. And you'll notice I'm wearing my gloves too. So, but I wanted to talk about this, which is called an herbalist staff. And it's really a beautiful example of how iron and metal, what an important role they played within various cultures in African society, and even into the 18th, 19th centuries, into the 20th century. First of all, the use of iron to make these objects was very special. There were only certain groups, the Yoruba were one of them, who had the people within their cultures that were skilled at what we would call blacksmithing, that is, making objects from iron. And objects made from iron were considered particularly powerful. And we can understand why, spiritually powerful, because number one, iron is hard to make. It's also very durable. When you think of the idea of Shango throwing down the boulders and creating thunder and lightning, you would associate that with the idea of fire and noise and heat that would have been needed in order to make this beautiful object and other beautiful objects like this one out of iron. So this herbalist staff would have been used by someone who was a healer, someone who was practicing herbal medicine or curative medicine, using herbs and natural materials that were found in the environment where this culture was located. So on this particular staff, you can see that there are elements that if we look here, we can see there's like a little leaf form here that comes off of what is a beautiful, I'm going to turn it in profile so you can see, it's a beautiful bird. And there are other beautiful birds here and leaves forms there along the edges of this, at the top of these little elements that come up, the little sticks that come up off the support base here. That is because And the other thing about this leafy kind of a form is it also represents a blade, because the herbalists had to go out and they used blades of iron to go out and cut the herbs that they needed for their practice. And the birds are there because birds are associated with the idea of hunting and finding and seeking within this Yoruba culture. And they also are associated with the female. The female was associated with gathering and being in nature as a hunter and a gatherer was also a female attribute among the Yoruba as well. And so but also, in addition, as we can make that connection, females were associated with regeneration, with life, with making new life. So in associating the herbalist staff with the female making new life, it connects the spiritual power of women and nature to the herbalist, which is why he would have had this beautiful staff that would have symbolized for the people who were coming to him his power as a healer. So that's basically what I'm going to put this back over here safely. And we're going to, I think, have a little bit of time that we can talk about some questions that Elisabeth had. And also anyone else who would like to join in and ask any kind of questions. I'm not the most expert, but in working with this beautiful material, I've learned fascinating things about African art that make it really fun for me to do this kind of thing and talk about it. So, yay.
So as Margaret Lynne said, if anybody watching has any questions, please feel free to ask them. I'm watching the Facebook channel right now, so keeping an eye on it. But while we're waiting for those to come in, Margaret Lynne, I really, while I was thinking about this exhibition, I thought it was a really special parallel that we have a traditional African sculpture exhibition at the end of the year. When we welcomed 2020, we still had power, beauty, and wisdom up. Little did we know what kind of year we would have. Our exhibition schedule kind of shifted. But I think that's really, Power, Beauty, and Wisdom was a beautiful and expansive show. And we welcomed the year. And now as we are sort of saying goodbye to 2020,
right.
We have this more intimate show in this gallery that also deals with authority and highlighting these beautiful African sculptures. Was that intentional scheduling or just happy COVID 2020
happy happenstance? Well, the location of this show in the gallery where it's located really was happy happenstance, because we had made a plan to put up more material at the end of the year. And actually our goal was actually to have it up during the summer in a different space. But we ended up using the space that it's in now specifically because we wanted it to be accessible to the public at the entrance of the museum before we opened all of the museum to the public. This is a space that was accessible to people who were visiting the garden on a limited basis. They could come inside. So we did put it there for that reason. But as I was saying at the beginning of the talk, it's like 2020. We have lemons, but we make lemonade as well as we can. And it just has worked out so beautifully to have this work in that space because of the shadows that are cast. And I didn't talk about those when we were looking at the installation photos, but there are gestures. In other words, there are sculptures in there that are lifting their arms, for example. And when you look at the sculpture and you look at the reflection of the sculpture in its shadow on the wall, you really see much better the angle of the reflection of the arms and how they create kind of this beautiful form that you just don't see with the arms and the legs. When you see the shadow, you see the relationship between the shapes so much better than you would in another installation. And the show at the beginning of the year, the Power and Beauty show, it was really focused almost exclusively on carving, wood carving too. There were some masks and some other painted objects, but it was very much focused on the idea of the feminine and feminine beauty and feminine influence in African cultures and the role of women. Whereas this is really sort of a mixed bag of objects that were associated with that idea of leadership or influence. And when I started thinking about selecting objects, one of the things that prompted me to do that was that we had talked about the influence of women in African culture in that first show, in Power and Beauty. And that led me to think, well, what objects do we have in our building that further talk about that or explicate that or are associated with that idea of leadership or authority? And when I started doing it, I found all these wonderful things, and voila, here we are. So it worked out. I think it did work out really well. Yeah.
It did. And I really like the sculptures and the cases in that gallery. I know we don't normally have cases, like that many cases in that gallery. So
we don't.
I'll say this again, since the museum's reopened, if you haven't come to visit us yet while we've been reopened, please do to come see this exhibition and see these wonderful cases and these sculptures where you can interact with them in new ways.
Right, exactly.
We have several. We have one question from Tara Sartorius.
Hello, Tara Sartorius.
Hello. Are there pieces in this collection or exhibition from the area of current day Cameroon?
I don't believe that any of the objects that we have in this exhibition are from Cameroon. No. I believe that we do have on loan at least a couple of objects that are associated with what is present day Cameroon, but not in this particular show. No.
Maybe next time.
Maybe.
Another question from Paula Susan, referencing the exhibition of African art. She's remembering that stools were used for the dead ancestors in the chief's home. Is that also true of this particular stool chair?
The stool chair that we looked at would not have been a stand for another sculptural object. But what she's saying is, if there were ancestors who were being honored, sometimes the stand, quote unquote, that they were put on, those sculptures of the ancestor, would have been the form of a stool or a chair. The thing that we looked at, the object we looked at, though, was specifically used in that particular initiation ceremony for girls within that Lagura culture. And those girls or someone associated with that initiation would have been the only people that would have ever sat on something like that. And they would have only, as I said, done it very, very briefly as an element of their initiation. It was not something where people would typically sit on it to sit and rest as we would do, with a chair or a stool in our culture. It was a statement on the part of the people who were running the initiation, basically, that this girl had done what she needed to do to be bonded to her group, her culture, and the spirit. So sitting on that stool for a moment kind of confirmed her within that cultural tradition.
Excellent question. Thank you, Tara and Paula. Our next question is from Frank Gitcher. Hi, Frank.
Hello, Frank.
Also referencing the previous exhibition, Power, Beauty, and Wisdom, he says that he was surprised by how many pieces exhibited were not particularly ancient.
Right.
That because of use, newer pieces were created to replace worn objects. Is that the case for what you have shown in this exhibition today?
Yeah, absolutely. All of the objects that we have in the museum are 20th century objects, but they are objects that most of them were made within traditions that were very old traditions, and they replicate older objects. Many of these objects that are in the museum and in this show were actually used. They were used within those traditions in the same way that earlier objects would have been used. And Frank is kind of referring to something that is very common. You don't find a tremendous number of African objects, ceremonial objects, that can be dated back to even the 19th century for a lot of reasons. For one thing, they were used, and so a lot of times they were used up, so they didn't exist. The other reasons are that the climate in Africa, especially, is very harsh. And if objects are left in rain or in a wet environment, or even or for wood in a dry environment, they deteriorate over time, and really pretty quickly. There's insect infestations. There's no climate control like we have air conditioning, and in a museum we have all of that. In their original homes and in their places where they were used, they would have been exposed to a lot of natural elements that would have led to their degradation over time. But the key thing about African objects that we've talked about extensively when we're talking about Power and Beauty and any of the African material and shows that we've done, normally these are not identified by having been made by a particular artist the way we would identify something in a Western culture. There was no quote unquote artist for a particular thing. There were carvers who made their living carving, but they probably also made a living doing other things too. But the key to this is, when they made something, when these makers, artists made these things, they were copying earlier traditions when they made them. So they're very similar in style, type, and use to things that are much older, even though they are 20th century. I hope that's a good and clear answer.
I think that's important to keep in mind. They didn't change styles as often as Western art does. When you study Western art history, you have the different periods, but with African, holding on to those traditions, and, those symbols are very important, and they stay important to those cultures. So it continues. So that's very important to keep in mind when looking at these objects, and why when you see our African sculpture exhibitions and you go to like the High or other museums, you probably see similar objects that are the same style, and that's for a reason.
Very much so. And if you went to a collection like that of African material at a museum like the Cleveland Museum of Art or the Philadelphia Museum, or the University of Pennsylvania has a wonderful collection, the Metropolitan does also. Some of those larger museums have been collecting material for many, many years, and you will see earlier versions, maybe even from the 19th century, of some of these types of objects. And you can see the relationship of the form and the symbolism and how they were used. They will look somewhat different, but you can definitely make the connection between that earlier material and the 20th century material, strictly because of that idea of the continuity of tradition, for sure.
Excellent. So thank you, Frank, for that. And then we have, I think, one last question from Lisa Newcomb, since we've had so many wonderful questions. And Margaret, Lynne, your explanations have been so wonderful and in depth.
I hope.
From Lisa, if these objects that are sacred and passed down through families, how were they collected?
That's a good question, and they were collected in many, many different kinds of ways. In the 19th century, there were European countries that came in and colonized in Africa. With them, they brought missionaries and Christian missionary preachers and people who came in for a dual purpose. They were sent to educate people within those countries, within the traditions of the West, and also to proselytize and convert them to Christianity. A lot of those people actually took these objects from these cultures and would leave with them. They would collect them and take them back to Europe. They were collected sometimes in that way. That was, not the best and most lovely thing for those objects, because we really don't know exactly where they came from other than by the use of symbolism and style in those objects. They just landed in European collections later, and many times in anthropological museums. They landed in those museums as artifacts rather than as art. So it's interesting that a lot of material ended up getting into collections that way. Also, unfortunately, there were military expeditions by European conquerors, and the soldiers themselves, would basically take this work or take these objects, and they would take it as souvenirs more than anything else, or as exotic things to take home with them, not really understanding that they were taking things that were of such momentous spiritual importance to these groups. And so there was a lot of just these things being, for lack of a better term, just stolen from these people, and then taken to Europe and put into these institutions. There were also later, I think, there was a realization that these things are valuable. They're important elements of the culture themselves, important representations of the spiritual practices of these different cultures and peoples. And quite honestly, now in 20th century Africa, there is more of a modern perception of religion and spirituality. A lot of the ceremonies that were very common in the 19th and early 20th century, those are less common today. There's more of a modern kind of approach to religion and spirituality there that is more in line with what is an international approach. But I think that there is still an appreciation for these objects and their importance amongst the people who they are their tradition. They would want them and would save them. However, there is also the understanding that they have monetary value now within the structure of the art market in the West. So some of these things are sold into the market, either intentionally, or they were taken by someone and then they were later sold without the knowledge of the people who actually owned it in the first place. So a lot of this material, though, has come into the market in such a way that it's legitimately come from use, and other things have replaced them within the tradition or culture of that group. So they're available and on the market to be put into museums. And frankly, the most important things, the earliest things, I think, there's definitely a sense that I think in these African communities, they want those very important artifacts to remain with them. And so you'll see activity on the part of governments now and cultural groups in Africa to try to repatriate some of that material from where it was put into museums. And I think they have had varying success in doing that. But a lot of material are things that there are multiples of that. And I think there is a perception that having this material in Western museums helps to educate and make people better aware of the importance of those cultures and the things that they made as art to be used within their traditions. Yeah.
So a few different sub-reasons, and Lisa asked a follow-up, which you sort of answered about there being an effort to return them to families. And so governments are working with museums to bring some objects back, or kind of be involved in the interpretation of objects in galleries, which is an ongoing thing, especially with expansion of empires and taking objects from like colonies, Africa, the Middle East, the native peoples of the Americas. And so that's, that's very much in the mind of museums right now, is
right,
repatriating and, working with these cultures and these peoples with these objects.
Yeah, especially
great question.
Especially things that have deep spiritual significance. There's an emphasis on taking out of museum collections human remains, for example, and returning those to the cultures from which they may have been taken. And then other important objects that cultures will approach institutions and say, this is an important historical object for our culture, our group, and we want to have access to it again. And many museums are in a position where they would not hesitate to try to find a solution to get an object back available to the cultural group to which it is connected, either that group specifically, or at least return it to its country of origin to make sure it is accessible to those people. Yeah.
So ongoing.
Yeah.
That's a good question, Lisa. Thank
Very
you.
much so.
So with that, unfortunately, we have hit our hour. Margaret, Lynne, thank you for being with me tonight. And I hope everyone has enjoyed the conversation. Thank you, everyone, for your questions and your comments. And now, again, another push. The museum galleries are reopened and you can come see this exhibition in person. And we hope you do, and we hope to see you at the museum. Thank you, Margaret, Lynne. Thank you again.
Yep. And you know what, Elizabeth?
Say something, sorry.
Well, I was going to say, you might also want to mention that starting Sunday, we're going to open a new temporary exhibition at the museum, and it will be accessible to the public, so you can see not just this, but a new temporary show. And we won't tell you what it is. We're going to make you come and see how wonderful it is, and you will be pleased. So come and see this exhibition, Authority Figures, and this new exhibition called Blow Up.
It's very fun. So hope to see you guys this weekend.
Yep.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Have a good night. Stay safe out there with Tropical Storm Zeta. And we'll see you next time. Bye.
Thank you. Bye now.